Was Australia ever truly an empty land? Long before a British ship ever appeared on the horizon, this vast continent was alive, breathing with stories, songs, and civilizations that had endured for tens of thousands of years. Every river, rock, and desert wind carried the footprints of a people who knew the land not as property, but as a living relative. Archaeological discoveries reveal that humans have lived in Australia for over 60,000 years, making it home to one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. The Aboriginal peoples were not wandering nomads, as the colonizers later claimed. They were skilled hunters, gatherers, astronomers, and engineers. Their knowledge of the environment was precise and scientific, passed down through generations in the form of songlines, intricate oral maps that could guide a person across vast, seemingly featureless distances. Across the continent, more than 250 distinct language groups existed, each with its own governance, customs, and laws. Their societies were organized, their boundaries respected, and their spirituality deeply tied to the dream time. The creation stories that linked people to the earth, the animals, and their ancestors. To the Aboriginal nations, the land was not empty. It was sacred. Every tree and waterhole had a name and a meaning. Every mountain carried a story. Their relationship with the environment was built on care and balance, taking only what was needed and giving back through rituals and respect. Even the Torres Strait Islanders, in the far north between Australia and Papua New Guinea, thrived on fertile islands surrounded by coral reefs. They traded, fished, farmed, and built strong, vibrant communities long before any European contact. By the time European explorers began mapping the edges of the continent, Indigenous Australians had already mastered its extremes, from the tropical north to the arid interior. They created complex tools from stone and wood, used controlled fire to manage vegetation and promote new growth, and developed sustainable food systems in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Yet to the outside world, they were invisible. The idea that Australia was terra nullius, nobody us land, would later erase their existence in legal and political terms. But before that lie took hold, there was an entire civilization living in harmony with their environment, unseen by those who would soon arrive to claim it. For over 60 millennia, they had no need for fences, flags, or written borders. Their laws were inscribed in memory, their heritage in the soil itself. And then in 1770, a ship named the Endeavour would arrive, carrying a man whose map would change everything. The British would call it discovery. But for those already here, it was the beginning of something else, the rewriting of their very existence. In April 1770, Captain James Cook sailed along the eastern coast of Australia, mapping unfamiliar shores and claiming the land for King George III of Britain. With a few strokes of ink, he declared the vast continent as part of the British Empire, a land he called New South Wales. Yet in this moment of so-called discovery, something profound was erased: the lives, cultures, and histories of the people who had been there for thousands of years. Cook's journals reveal an explorer intrigued by what he saw, but ultimately guided by imperial purpose. He described the indigenous people as natives of a wild state, unaware that they lived in one of the most ecologically sophisticated societies on Earth. When he planted the British flag, he did so under the doctrine of terra nullius, the belief that the land belonged to no one because its inhabitants didn't practice agriculture or build cities in the European sense. This single flawed assumption would justify centuries of dispossession. 18 years later, in 1788, the first fleet of 11 British ships arrived in Botany Bay, carrying over 1,000 settlers, many of them convicts. To the British, this marked the beginning of a grand colonial experiment. To the Aboriginal peoples of the Eora Nation, who lived in the region, it was the arrival of strangers who brought not just steel and gunpowder, but disease, fear, and displacement. The first colony was established at Port Jackson, now the site of modern Sydney. Governor Arthur Phillip raised the Union Jack and declared the land British territory. There were no treaties, no negotiations, and no recognition of the people who already lived there. The British viewed the land as a blank slate, an empty canvas for empire building. But it was never empty. Aboriginal communities observed these new arrivals with a mix of curiosity and caution. At first, there were some cautious exchanges, food, language, and gestures of peace. Yet, misunderstanding and mistrust grew quickly. The settlers' livestock trampled sacred sites and vital hunting grounds. The introduction of foreign diseases devastated indigenous populations, wiping out entire clans who had no immunity to smallpox and influenza. Still, the British saw opportunity. Australia became a convenient solution to Britain's overcrowded prisons and a valuable extension of imperial ambition. As more convicts and free settlers arrived, towns expanded, forests were cleared, and the native people were pushed further and further from their lands. From the perspective of London, this was progress, the expansion of civilization to a new world. But for those who watched their lands vanish under colonial fences, it was an invasion cloaked in a legal fiction. The settlers came believing they had found an unclaimed land. What they truly found was a world they did not understand, one that had its own laws, languages, and ancient order. And as the colony grew, resistance began to rise. Indigenous warriors, once peaceful observers, now faced the impossible task of defending their world from an empire that refused to see them. The coming years would reveal the hidden wars that reshaped a continent, a struggle for survival that history would long try to forget. Their resistance wasn't a challenge to authority. It was a desperate defense of their ancient homelands, their sacred sites, and their very way of life. What followed was not a series of isolated skirmishes, but a prolonged, brutal conflict known as the Frontier Wars. From the sun-scorched deserts of the interior to the lush, fertile river valleys of the coast, clashes erupted. Indigenous warriors, armed with spears and an intimate knowledge of the land, fought back against settlers who came with guns and a sense of entitlement. These weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic struggles against the seizure of hunting grounds, the destruction of sacred sites, and the tearing apart of families and communities. Disease, introduced by the newcomers, had already devastated many populations, but now bullets and fire threatened those who remained. Settlers often recorded their victories as signs of progress, erasing the stories of indigenous resistance from the historical record. The goal was not just to take the land, but to erase the people who belonged to it. Colonial maps were drawn over ancient songlines, claiming vast territories as uninhabited, even as the ground itself bore witness to millennia of culture, law, and human presence. But you cannot erase 60,000 years of history. Despite the overwhelming odds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities survived. Their resilience became their greatest weapon. Survival itself was an act of defiance. They adapted, finding ways to preserve their languages, customs, and spiritual beliefs, even in the shadow of immense loss. Oral histories, ceremonies, and art became the invisible threads that kept their culture alive, weaving a connection between past generations and those yet to come. In the north, Torres Strait Islanders skillfully navigated the pressures of new settlers, protecting their unique maritime traditions while selectively engaging with the outside world. The myth of an empty land was a convenient fiction, but it could not hold. The continent was never empty. Every river, every mountain, every tree had a name, a story, and a purpose within a complex cultural system. This land had been tended, loved, and defended for longer than any other culture on Earth. The displacement, the massacres, and the legal oppression could not change that fundamental truth. Australia had never been terra nullius. As the 20th century dawned, a new struggle began, not with spears and muskets, but with words, laws, and a demand for justice. For decades, Indigenous Australians were denied legal recognition, land rights, and basic human dignity. Their voices were silenced in textbooks and official histories. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, and in 1992, a seismic shift occurred. The High Court of Australia delivered its landmark decision in Mabo v. Queensland. This ruling forever overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius. It was a monumental victory, recognizing that Indigenous peoples had lived on and maintained rights to their land for thousands of years before British arrival. The tireless fight of one man, Eddie Koiki Mabo, a Torres Strait Islander from Mer, became a powerful symbol of justice for all First Nations peoples. The decision acknowledged a simple, profound truth. Australia was never empty. The Mabo decision didn't end the struggle. but it marked the beginning of a new chapter, a journey toward reconciliation. It paved the way for native title legislation, allowing indigenous communities to reclaim traditional lands. It sparked a national conversation about Australia's true history and forced the nation to confront its own founding myths. Today, that journey continues. Efforts in education, cultural preservation, and public recognition are working to heal the wounds of the past and honor the enduring legacy of the First Nations peoples. The story of Australia is a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of dates. It's a living narrative shaped by whose voices are heard, whose culture is celebrated, and whose connection to the land is recognized. The arrival of Europeans was not the beginning of Australia's story. It was merely a recent chapter in an epic that began tens of thousands of years ago. Understanding this doesn't just reshape how we see the past. It challenges us to build a more just and truthful future. Australia was never empty. It was alive, it was vibrant, and its first peoples, through their incredible resilience, continue to shape its identity. The lesson is clear. History belongs to those who remember it, and truth belongs to those brave enough to tell it. Thank you for joining us on this important journey through history. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that uncovers the stories that deserve to be told.